This lecture focuses on some concrete examples of economic extent decisions, decisions that answer the question how much or how many. Now remember, the two key focal points in any extent decision are marginal revenue and marginal cost. To maximize profit, we need to find that level of production or output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Finding this balancing point is the key element in any economic decision involving production levels, pricing levels, or any extent decision that answers the question how much or how many. For instance, some examples of extent decisions. Should you change your level of advertising? How much advertising should you be doing? Should you increase the quality of the service? How much service should you be providing for a given level of a price? Is your staff large enough, or is it too big? How many staff members should you have? How many parking spaces should you lease out? Again, how many? Any question that can be framed in terms of how much or how many is an economic extent decision, and a proper economic decision should be governed by marginal analysis. Marginal analysis is very simple. At its basic level, it involves taking very small steps. Now, marginal analysis will tell us what direction to go in. For instance, we should hire more staff members or fewer staff members, but won't tell us what that optimal level is. It won't tell us how far to go. It tells us what direction, but not how far to go. You just have to keep going in the right direction until you find you're at that sweet spot, that tipping point, the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue and the profit level has been maximized. Let's consider the following example. How much advertising should a particular firm engage in? A particular increase in spending, a $50,000 increase in television ad revenue budget, brought in 1,000 additional customers. The estimated marginal cost for the television advertising is therefore $50. On average, it cost $50 per new customer, and with a $50,000 expenditure, 1,000 new customers were obtained. This marginal cost is simply equal in this case to the total expenditures divided by the total number of units obtained. If the marginal revenue generated by each additional customer is greater than $50, then such an ad revenue or ad campaign would be profitable. It would, by definition, bring in more than $50,000 in additional revenue. On the other hand, if the marginal revenue were less than the marginal cost, or less than $50, such an ad campaign would, by its very definition, be unprofitable and would bring in less than it cost to obtain those additional customers. Even if a firm is unable to actually measure or obtain an estimate of the marginal revenue attributable, say, to an ad campaign, marginal revenue and marginal analysis and marginal cost can still be useful, even if we know only one or the other. For instance, suppose that a company is trying to determine the most profitable form of advertising, comparing telephone versus television ad solicitations. If they have information on the cost and the number of new customers acquired for each of those two forms of advertising, they can make a determination about which one is more profitable or which one has the lower marginal cost. Suppose that they recently cut their telephone budget by $10,000 and observed a loss in 100 customers. That suggests that the marginal cost of obtaining a customer by advertising via telephone is about $100, the 10,000 divided by 100. Now compare this with the marginal cost of obtaining customers, say, through television, which we saw a moment ago to be about $50 per customer. Even without knowing the marginal revenue side of this, knowing that the marginal cost of obtaining a customer through television is about half that of obtaining the customer through telephone solicitation, in this case, it would point the company in the direction of more television advertising, less telephone advertising. So even comparing the marginal costs of two different mutually exclusive alternatives, in this case the phone and the television advertising, can help to make sound economic decisions. So the takeaway point here when applying marginal analysis is to oftentimes, from a practical standpoint, make small changes in price observe the changes in quantity, and use that empirical data to make estimates of marginal cost or marginal revenue. As long as you're moving in the right direction, taking those small steps allows you to move gradually in the direction of the optimal level of output and the profit maximizing level of output without overshooting, without going too far. Here's a second example. A Fortune 50 company is producing textiles at a number of different plants in Latin America. And each plant operates as its own cost center. The cost centers are rewarded for reducing the costs associated with the textile production. The standard absorbed hours, or SAH, is a standard measure of textile factory output. And so each plant is measured based on the ratio of cost to SAH, or standard absorbed hours. It's sort of a cost per unit measure in the textile industry. So let's take two plants. Plant A is operating in the Dominican Republic. Plant B is operating in the Yucatan. And each of these plants has different costs, different standard absorbed hours, and this particular company is trying to decide whether one plant is more or less efficient than the other, and if so, perhaps consider shifting some production to the more efficient plant. So let's suppose that plant A has costs of $30 per standard absorbed hour. Plant B has costs of $20 per standard absorbed hour. How could the company use that information to improve profitability? The obvious answer would seem to be that the production should be moved or migrated to the cost center with lower costs per standard absorbed hour, the $20 per standard absorbed hour at plant B. And this indeed would be the right decision. Bear in mind, however, that the cost per standard absorbed hour is not really a direct measure of marginal cost. So if the company decided to make this switch to increase production at plant B and reduce production at plant A, reducing output in the Dominican Republic and increasing output in the Yucatan, the idea there is that they're going to be avoiding $30 per SAH at plant A or factory A and incurring only $20 per additional SAH at plant B. And they'd want to make sure that that was in fact the case. So paying attention as production went down at plant A to see whether in fact they were avoiding $30 per SAH. Sometimes those costs might include embedded fixed costs, and so they would want to be verifying in real time that in fact the costs were going down at the level expected. And conversely at plant B, paying attention to total costs and measuring the incremental marginal costs associated with additional production. If those costs are close to $20 per standard absorbed hour, then that validates the decision and suggests it was profitable. On the other hand, if costs are increasing at more than $20 per SAH, it suggests that the original measure was probably a poor proxy for marginal costs, and ultimately the economic decision, to the extent that it was poorly made or was not the right one, was based upon a poor proxy for marginal cost. So if that were the case, it's not the case that marginal cost is the wrong measure, it's just the measure of cost per standard absorbed hour, maybe only very imperfectly correlated with the true underlying marginal cost. Here's another example of an extent decision. Suppose that you've got a tract of land, and on this tract of land you have 100 trees. You'd like to get this tract of land cleared, and you'd like to have received the maximum amount for the trees and the timber that are being cleared. So you get two bids, and the first bid is for $150 per tree. The second bid is for a total of $15,000 flat fee, and that bid agrees to clear all of the trees. Now on this land you have 50 fir trees, which are of lower value, and 50 pine trees, which are of higher value. The fir trees are worth $100 a piece. The pine trees are worth $200 a piece, and they're 50 of each. So if we take the total value of all the trees combined, the 50 pine trees are worth $10,000, 50 fir trees are worth $5,000. Total value there is $15,000. Now consider these two bids and ask yourself the question, if you were on the side of this transaction where you were the bidder, what would be your incremental or marginal cost and your incremental or marginal revenue if you won the bid? Let's put ourselves in the shoes of the first bidder, who bid $150 per tree. The marginal cost is fixed for you. It's $150 per tree. Your marginal revenue for the pine trees is $200. You would certainly want to harvest those because you're harvesting a tree that's more valuable than the $150 that you have to pay. But for the fir trees, which are worth only $100, your marginal cost of $150 exceeds the marginal revenue. Obviously, your incentive would be not to harvest those. The end result would likely be a situation where the first bidder harvests the 50 fir trees and pays $150 apiece, or $7,500 total. The second bidder agrees to pay $15,000 up front. The incremental or marginal cost beyond that is zero. So they will have an incentive to harvest every tree that generates positive marginal revenue. In this case, that would be both the pine trees and the fir trees. And so if they paid $15,000 up front, their incentive would clearly be to harvest all of the remaining trees. And in fact, all of those remaining trees would deliver a total value, as we said a moment ago, of $15,000. If your goal as the landowner is to get all the trees cleared off the land, or if your goal is to receive the maximum possible revenue, clearly the second bid would be the optimal bid to accept. Understanding the marginal costs and benefits and the incentives associated with that bid in this admittedly simple example nevertheless leads to the optimal economic decision. Yet another example of marginal costs and marginal benefits would be incentives and sales commissions. Consider a salesperson selling items with a price tag of $10,000 a piece. And on average, salespeople in this particular industry can be expected to sell about 100 units per year. 100 units at $10,000 a piece generates about $1 million in annual revenue. Let's consider two options or commission structures. First option is a straight 10% commission. That would have, at a $1 million sales level, an expected payoff for the salesperson of about $100,000, 10% of $1 million. Option two is a flat $50,000 salary plus a 5% commission. This also would generate an expected payoff of $100,000. The commission piece would be 5% of $1 million, or $50,000, which when added to the fixed salary of $50,000 generates a $100,000 expected payoff. But consider the incentives. If we assume that the incremental cost to the salesperson of an additional unit of sale, cost in terms of effort, perhaps travel time, whatever other energy or effort are involved in making that extra sale. If the cost to the salesperson, the marginal incremental cost, is the same, which of these two contracts will result in or provide incentives for greater levels of sales? Well, it'll be the one most likely that has the highest marginal revenue. The marginal revenue of option one for every $10,000 sale is about $1,000 for the salesperson. The marginal or incremental revenue for option two is $500. So to the extent that each additional sale becomes harder and harder beyond some point, option one will most likely result in a higher level of output because the salesperson will continue to exert effort until that point where the marginal or incremental effort required to make one more sale is just equal to that $1,000 marginal revenue. Option two has only a $500 marginal revenue, and as a result will most likely induce a lower level of effort and lower level of sales. The key points in this discussion are that there are really two factors in any extent decision: marginal cost and marginal revenue. To maximize profit or profitability, we need to find the point or the place where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Finding this balancing point is the key issue in any extent decision-making situation. Thanks for listening.